Okay, so hello everybody. Welcome to the Crime Week session for today. I'm excited to be here to talk to you about all things morality, which is my research expertise area. So I've got lots to say about this. Thanks for the introduction, Lauren, and thanks for the kind of instructions about microphones and chat boxes and things. One thing I'll add is that I'm quite happy for you to add any questions or comments in the chat box throughout while I'm speaking, actually, because it's quite nice for me to be able to see what you're thinking, what you're discussing. You know, if anybody else in the room with you has anything that they want to say and you can type on their behalf, it's quite a nice way for me to get a sense of what you're interested in and your thoughts on what I'm saying. Otherwise, there'll be time for questions at the end as well. So very happy to hear from you throughout and at the end, whenever you prefer. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about me. So I joined ARU in 2016, so I've been here for about 6 years or so now, and I lecture on lots of the criminology degrees. So we've got criminology and sociology, psychology and criminology and policing, and others in there as well. So I teach across those different criminology-related subjects and programs. And in my role here over the last 3 years or so, I've been the course leader. So I've been looking after kind of all aspects of the day-to-day running of the programs. And involved in kind of how we change things and develop things and improve things, which is quite a cool part of the role. So as Lauren said, one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing is writing up journal articles, so academic texts with the findings from my work, and then they go out into the world and hopefully get read by other social scientists and practitioners. And my ultimate goal is that this work will end up going towards current practice and policy. So the work that I do to try to evidence the link between weak morality, and then I'll explain how I define that in a minute, and involvement in antisocial behavior and crime, my goal and my main objective is for that to be somehow put into policy. So one idea that I have for that is that we can attempt to try and strengthen some of those psychological characteristics in the hope that then there is young people are less likely to be involved in, say, antisocial behavior and crime activities. I'm going to explain a lot more about this during the course of the next half an hour, 40 minutes. But that's kind of a bit about me, really. So this new study that I'm administering this year is kind of all up and running and all excitement everywhere at the moment, because we're trying to get everything sorted in terms of the research design process, recruiting participants, working out our methodology, and so on. And I'm going to tell you a lot more about that in a moment. So that's a bit about me. So let's start talking a little bit about morality itself. So we're going to talk about why some people believe, some academics believe, that offenders commit crime. What happens in that decision-making process? So a lot of what we talk about today actually involves psychological criminology or criminal psychology. It's all about how the mind works, how we make decisions, how we make choices, the factors that have an input into those decision-making processes, and what we can do about that to attempt to adapt or change if we think it's necessary to do so, or if we think it would be advantageous to do so, rather. And so it follows for me that if we're thinking about how people make decisions and carry out different actions, the part that comes before, during development, childhood and adolescent development, is really, really interesting, because it's the experiences that we go through during that time period of our lives that can really have an influence on the way that we think and behave. So there's lots to think about here, and these are things that I've been reading and thinking about for a number of years now. So we'll think about what's right, what's wrong, what happens when we don't agree on what's right and wrong, and that's really key, because we won't agree on what's right and wrong, and I'm going to ask you about that in a moment. So get ready to give me some answers in the chat box. And ultimately, we're looking to think about how we can reduce crime. So there are so many different ideas in criminology. Criminology has been around for kind of 80 years or so now. So it's quite a young discipline compared to something like psychology that's been around for a lot longer than that. So we're still waking up every day, those of us that work in criminology, and have so many questions that need to be answered that we're not quite there yet. We don't have the answers. So that's why I'm really passionate and excited about the kinds of things that we'll talk about today. And hopefully you might be too if you're interested in these subjects. So one of the things that I think about here when it comes to morality is how morality is an individual level factor. So by that, I mean, it's a part of us and our person. It's a part of the brain, the way it functions, the mind. It's a psychological trait. But when it comes to crime, we always carry out acts in an environment or in a setting of some kind. So we can't just talk about the person, individual level characteristics like morality. We have to think about where the person is as well, because that really can influence whether or not the crime will occur. So I should have said, I know some of you are joining us from Peterborough. A lot of my work is actually based on a huge longitudinal study that took place in Peterborough called the Peterborough Adolescent and Young Adult Development Study, PADS+. And I worked with that program for some time. It went on for over 10 years. And we interviewed over 700 people in Peterborough. And so I know the parkway and the surrounding areas relatively well, because we would travel around and interview these 700 participants in Peterborough. And we followed them. It's longitudinal. So we followed the same group across an over 10-year period. Excuse my cough. And we found out all about their lives, their crime, their families, their education, their thoughts and attitudes, opinions, perspectives, everything about their lives, including some geographical mapping around Peterborough as well, which was quite cool. We took a diary, a 4-day diary of where young people went, who they were with, what they were doing, and of course, if there was any antisocial behaviour or crime. And then we were able to kind of line that up with where those activities were taking place and at what times and things like that. And so we were finding that a lot of the violent events, for example, took place either in or outside evening entertainment settings, like the pubs and the clubs and so on. This is pre-pandemic, all of this stuff. So I imagine that some of these things would have been wildly different when some of those venues were closed. But the thinking about the time of day is important. They were generally, in those evening hours, and there were peaks on the Friday nights and the Saturday evenings and so on. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the morality part is really important. There's lots of evidence, loads of studies carried out with different samples in different areas of the world, using slightly different methods, and lots of them provide really compelling evidence that there's a link between people not thinking it's wrong to carry out an action and then the likelihood that they will carry out an action. Now that seems quite obvious. It might seem obvious to you, it seems obvious to me in some ways, but there hasn't actually been a study in criminology that has attempted to do something about that and take it one step further to see, but so what? So we found a link. Yes, we're saying that people don't think it's wrong are more likely to hit someone or steal something or whatever the crime is, but we haven't thought far enough yet. Like I say, criminology is quite young in that respect, to what we can do about that. And that's what's going to lead me to kind of the second half of what I'll talk about today, the morality strengthening program. So we think about the individual, we think about the environment, lots of things probably going around in your head now, because I've laid the seed for quite a few of the different ideas that I'm interested in. So see what you think of that, what you make of that, and what your comments are, what you think is important or isn't important, and why. Have you seen something in the news lately, in the crime news that's happened that's linked to what I said? Or have you come across something or someone where you had a conversation where, something relevant to this has come up? And if that's the case, please could you type into the chat box while I am speaking. In fact, this is what we do when we deliver our lectures at ARU Criminology. We're really proud of that kind of the interactive nature of all of our engagements, even if it's online, even if it's face-to-face. So please do type along to me, and I will keep an eye on the chat box while I'm speaking. So the other thing to think about here when it comes to criminal decision making is whether it is emotional or whether it's rational or whether it can be both. So usually when we talk about emotional decision making, it's that we are led and dictated by the emotions that we feel. So if I feel really angry that somebody has pushed into me in a pub, then I let that dictate my decision to hit them in the face because I'm angry or because I'm ashamed or all manner of other negative emotions, or because I feel a lack of shame or guilt about potentially hitting someone in the face, which again is one of the core parts of my research I'll tell you about. Or on the other hand, we can think about rationality. So rationality, you might have come across this in some of your social science subjects. We're really thinking about like an appraisal of the costs and benefits of carrying out the action. So there's no room there for emotion. That's much more of a logical, balanced, kind of steady approach. If I hit this person in the face because they've pushed past me in the pub, what will be the downsides of me punching them in the face? I might get into trouble. They might punch me back. A group of friends that they're with might all punch me back, and then I'll really be in trouble. I might feel rubbish about it afterwards. I might regret it afterwards. I might be under the influence of alcohol or drugs, and so I might not be fully confident in my decision to hit them in the face. So those are all the downsides. Then we think about the upside. Well, the upside is they just pushed me and I didn't like it, so I want to hit them in the face. It bruised my ego in some way. So these are all the sorts of things that I cover in my research, and which students generally find really interesting because it's not very black and white. There's a big grey area here where you say, I might think this is right under this circumstance, or it depends on whether, you know, the person that pushed me, it depends on whether they looked strong and like they would hit me back, or, you know, or all manner of different situations. So one thing that I'd really like you to take away from today is that there are lots of interesting positions and perspectives, and it's not necessarily the case that it is right or wrong, which is funny because that's the subject of the lecture. There's so much to think about, and there's usually a place for everyone's opinion on this, but the conclusion that I usually come to when we deliver this sort of discussion and lecture is, well, it depends, and we're none the wiser. We don't really know. But I find that really fascinating. That was really interesting. We have to kind of move our knowledge forward a little bit more as the days go on, nudge it forward as the days go on. So I have a question for you now, and I'm not sure, because of the way that you're set up in your rooms and how many people you have with you and so on, I'm not really sure how that's set up. So maybe it will work, maybe it won't. But the idea that I had was that I asked you this question, and hopefully you're already thinking about this because I've just been talking about it. So just imagine this is you. You're in a pub on a Saturday night with friends and somebody knocks into you. Now, which factors will play a role in whether you will push that person back or hit that person back? Or is it that you would limit it to just making a very rude comment back? Or is it that you would limit it even more to just glancing over in a negative way and walking away? So what is it? I've already given you some tips here, so you should be warmed up to this now. What sorts of things would play a role in how you would react, your decision making, essentially? So this is quite a good way to get you a little bit warmed up. So it's not very easy listening to somebody. I'm a lecturer and I lecture a lot, but I'm also a participant in a lot of these sorts of sessions, and I don't find it easy myself to listen for a big block of time. I like to do some thinking in between. So this is your chance now. I'm just going to give it maybe a minute or so. I can see some of you are typing, which is promising. And let's see what you come up with, and then we can discuss. So go ahead, please answer the question in the chat box. You're also very welcome to unmute your microphones if that's easier than typing for anybody. That's absolutely fine with me. Okay, so I think my decision would be based on the day so far. For example, if I'd had a bad day, I might react differently. Yes, thank you for that. So I think that's really interesting. For me, me, how the day is going so far usually dictates my mood. And there's some interesting research looking at mood, how it changes day to day, but also throughout the course of the day, and how that might influence the way we react, especially when we're faced with a conflict situation like this, or with a negative interaction with somebody else. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. Thank you for that. So I can't see anyone else typing right now. Presumably that might be because you're not in a position to type easily or something like that, but that's absolutely fine. So let me tell you a little bit about what I'm trying to get at here. So when faced, the whole premise of all of this work that I'm talking about today is that when we're faced with this sort of a potential conflict situation, there are lots of factors to consider, and they can be split into different groups. So they can be psychological, like the morality, and they can be environmental or setting level, like the things that I mentioned earlier on. And in crime, and if you were to study criminology at undergraduate level, this is how we can break things up to make them more absorbable, so we can kind of tackle each of these groups at once. So there might be sociological theories that talk about why crime occurs, and they might be more to do with the way that societies are structured, politics, the way that policies work in different societies and communities, the way that organizations are set up, those sorts of things, and inequalities and so on. Then you've got the biological theories, which are really, really fascinating and can branch across into neuroscientific stuff. I don't know if you've come across that so far in your studies, looking at how the brain functions and when the brain doesn't function, compared to comparing kind of patients that have had brain lesions, for example, with people with typically developing brains, and how they compare in terms of their decision making. Some really amazing research there. And what's really cool about that is the technologies that are used in order to get that data, like fMRI imaging, for example, has only really advanced and been more readily available and accessible and, you know, affordable in recent decades. So that's new data, that's new information that we just didn't know anything about before. We had no knowledge about before. So the biological and neuroscientific stuff is really interesting. Things like, have you heard about, you know, theories that there are certain genes, like the MOAA gene that may lead people to be more aggressive? And so they're really mixed findings on all of these things, and we have to tackle them quite carefully, their interpretations. But there's genetics research, there's biological research, and there's sociological research. Then there's psychological research, which has the big red line around it, because that's where morality falls, and other factors related to morality, like empathy, being able to understand things from another person's viewpoint, guilt, feeling bad about contemplating a certain action, shame, feeling bad about the idea of somebody else finding out about acting badly or breaking a rule or a law in some way. So these are the kinds of ways that we kind of break things up. And during the course of today's session, I sort of talk a little bit about the course and how we approach these things, and then bring us back to today's subject of morality. I think that will be quite a helpful way of presenting things to you. Okay, so I just want to pull up one of the other comments that came in. How much I've had to drink? Yeah, so lots of studies about alcohol and drug intoxication. Some studies to suggest that having kind of a moderate amount of alcohol may influence decision making in a different way to having an excessive amount of alcohol and reactions to those things. And they're actually really interesting when you interpret them when looking at self-control, which is on this slide here. So the idea that our executive functioning in our brain, we have an element of self-control. We're able to exercise our self-control in situations when it's needed, essentially. So that might be, you know, I've already had 2 slices of cake, I won't have another, self-control. Or it might be, I really want to hit this person, but I know I shouldn't, so I'm going to control that behavior and control contemplating that behavior. So alcohol can really interact with that process, essentially, that executive functioning. and alter the way in which we would normally typically behave in those situations. And you'll see on one of the slides coming up, like I mentioned, a lot of the violent events that I included in one of my samples for my PhD analysis with that PAD study in Peterborough, I interviewed 50 of the most violent, prolific offenders in that full sample of 700. So they were people who were actively involved in violence and sometimes to quite a high frequency. And they highlighted that when I asked them, what I did was I performed qualitative interviews with them. So I asked them, tell me about the most recent time that you had a fight or an interaction of violence with someone. For some people that was yesterday, the day before the interview, so for some people that was last month, and so on. But they would go into detail about that particular event. Who was there? Did they know the person? Were there weapons? Were there injuries? Alcohol, intoxication, morality, self-control, empathy, shame, guilt. And then I tied it all together and interpreted the findings. And I found that overwhelmingly, the 50 people in the sample, the majority did not feel it was wrong, did not feel that they thought about the other person, did not feel bad or bad at the consideration of if somebody else found out, like a parent or a friend or a teacher. So lots of the work that I'm talking about here is kind of built up from an evidence base that we've been collecting, both me and my colleagues have been collecting over the last kind of decade and a half. But it's quite difficult to get everything into one sort of 45-minute discussion. So I'll just pick pieces from here and there as I think it would interest you. So when a person commits a crime, it's useful to consider these things. I think we've already talked about those. I'm going to skip across to the next slide. Again, please do give any comments or questions in the chat box as I go. And we talked about this a little bit, alcohol, drugs, the influence of peers. Nobody mentioned that, but maybe that was because I mentioned peers earlier on. So another environment factor that's found to be really applicable to a lot of these violent events, talking about violence here because this particular PhD work was about violence. And so the majority of violent events are carried out with other peers around, and those peers are found to also routinely be involved in violence and not think it's wrong to commit that violence. So there's something to tap into there when we come to think about intervention programs later on for how we can reduce crime, thinking about how we can influence that in some way, selecting who young people are spending time with, and when they are, trying to tap into their feelings of right and wrong and discuss those as they line up with the law, and be mindful of that. Okay, I've just seen we've got a comment come in here. Does upbringing fall into morality, or is that not a psychological factor? That's a really good question, thank you. So my understanding of this and the way that I phrase this is that upbringing, so the way I phrase that is usually kind of our primary socialization experiences during our very early childhood all the way through to adolescence and young adulthood. So that socialization experience, so basically the parenting style, the parenting warmth, the parenting attachment, the time spent with peers and who those peers are, time spent with teachers. Generally, children and young people are spending the majority of their time with parents, peers and teachers. So those experiences that they have during their upbringing and the modeling that those other people provide for them in terms of right and wrong behaviors is found to be quite a really strong argument for what's going on here. So we talk a lot on the course about something called social learning theory, which you might be familiar with. So this is a theory, quite a well-established theory and think about this now while I'm talking in relation to you and your life. The idea with the theory is that those that we spend a lot of time with and surround ourselves with, the way that they behave, we see it, we imitate it, we mirror it in our own behavior, because that is the mechanism by which we learn what is right and wrong, if those around us are behaving in a certain way. And I think that's quite a convincing argument for how morality develops across childhood and adolescence. and how it can become quite strengthened across time. Because if your parent throws their litter, their crisp packets on the floor when you're out for a walk, and they keep doing that, and you see them doing that over and over again, it compounds that effect. And so you learn yourself that it's okay to drop litter, because you've seen somebody who you trust, who you have a close relationship with, who you spend a lot of time with doing that. Because there is no kind of guide or official place where we go to say, hang on a second, I'm just looking this up. Is this the right behavior? Is this the wrong behavior? In fact, if there was a guide like that, then I'd be out of a job, because I wouldn't have all these questions to answer. So yeah, I think that's really interesting. I hope I've answered your question there. If I haven't, please follow up with more questions. Okay, so and monitoring. So when we looked at the PAD study, monitoring was a really interesting element, because at that point, the young people, I should have said, were aged sort of 11 to about 21. So when they were a bit younger, obviously, as they became adults, monitors and supervisors doesn't become as much of an issue because they're adults. But when they were adolescents, we found that measuring the time that they spent unsupervised and in unstructured activities, so by that we meant not doing anything in particular, not at school, not at piano lesson, not wherever, not driving from here to here or being driven from here to here, but just generally hanging around, often with friends, often on street corners or parks and so on, with nowhere to really be or go. That was when a lot of the antisocial behaviour and crime was taking place. So the absence of supervisors or monitors like the police or teachers or members of the public, those are the times overwhelmingly in which a lot of the crime was taking place. But it's amazing that we've got this evidence base for this, but what we really need to do now, and what I would really encourage you to do as kind of new budding psychologists, criminologists, is to think about how we can apply that to our society right now, to people that are living today, and help people to have more kind of positive, fulfilling lives and futures, young people. And that sort of lines up with my intentions. So what we were talking about earlier on was the settings. And in these events, I mentioned the 50 violent interviews. Well, they weren't violent interviews, the 50 interviews with the prolific violent offenders is a better way of putting it. These percentages are the occurrence, the kind of influence of the factors in this list, the amount that it came up. So for example, 42%, so almost half of those events took place in or outside pubs and clubs. Almost all of them, like I just said, they were unsupervised or not monitored. And 4 out of 5, there was provocation of some sort. So that could be psychological provocation, like a verbal insult. It could be physical provocation, like a push or a hit. So that's something which I think is also really interesting, this idea of provocation, and how some people are believed to have a higher sensitivity to that provocation in that environment. Think about you and the people around you, your friends, your family members. I wonder whether you'd be able to identify some people that are more naturally sensitive to provocation in that way. It's all, I believe, part of our personality in the way that we go about things, and our kind of natural disposition, essentially. Again, I believe those factors, although some of these things are that we may be predisposed to some of these things genetically or biologically, I think the environment has a huge role to play, as in the environment during the upbringing period, the childhood and adolescent period, in kind of expressing some of those things that we may be predisposed to, for example, being sensitive to these things. You can see 62% alcohol was involved, 67% presence of peers, and then we mentioned activities. So these are all really interesting findings about where we see the crimes taking place, and where we should target. This is an example of one of those events. So, I told you there were 50 interviews. These are the kinds of questions I asked them. And one example about the alcohol. So for this particular participant, the most recent act of violence was 2 weeks before the interview. It was an evening weekend, which was the peak time for violent events. It happened to be at his dad's wedding at a hotel. They were dancing on the dance floor. The uncle tried to hit someone else, so the young person tried to stop him, and then they ended up hitting each other once, back and forth. 8 pints of beer were consumed by the participant. So didn't feel that it was wrong at all at the time, but the next day didn't think it was wrong, but felt guilty about behavior. And the main reason for the violence was the alcohol. So it's that lines up quite neatly with the comment that was made earlier on in the box. And this is an excerpt from that interview. What would you distinctive? The alcohol definitely. Oh, sorry, not from that interview, from 3 or 4 different interviews here. These are different participants where it says P. So one said the alcohol definitely, another said alcohol probably. Obviously, that was the main thing. If it wasn't for that, it wouldn't have happened. Another participant, I was just really angry and it just happened. I think the alcohol didn't help. It wasn't the best decision to make. It just sort of happened. Do you think feeling drunk influenced your decision? Yeah, probably. And then a few of them, because they went out regularly to these evening entertainment settings, habitually, say every weekend, and they drank alcohol or took drugs habitually, a lot of them, they would find it quite humorous. They were quite light-hearted in the way they talked about their violence, because it was a habitual thing for them. And so that's an interesting thing to think about. How do we tap into that? Okay, so let's gather what we've talked about so far a little bit now. So there are different theories of why crime occurs. Some focus more on the environment, some focus more on the individual. And my work, I think, tries to think about both, but has this focus on the individual, on the morality. And there are some criminologists, quite reputable criminologists, that have really tried to think about a combination of both, because I think that's really essential when we're trying to explain any behaviour, not just criminal behaviour, any behaviours. Like Terry Moffat, for example, has done lots of work looking at that. We talked a bit about emotional and rational. Do you think about it now? Ask yourselves, when you make decisions, not necessarily criminal decisions, everyday decisions, think about today, the decisions you've made so far up until this point. Do you usually lead those decisions with your head, or do you usually lead with your heart? And it's really interesting. I imagine what we would find here is that will probably be a mix between us. And for me, that would be mostly with my head, but very much dependent on mood and what else is going on at the time. So it's a really difficult question to answer. I like this quote. I've included this in here. And Antonio Damasio is a neuroscientist and has written some really good books about crime decision making. So he's making the point here that emotions are really, really important. And historically in criminology, what's happened is that theories seem to take more of that kind of rational approach, like they think that offenders do this kind of cost-benefit analysis of the pros and cons of committing a crime. But I think that's quite unrealistic to think of it that way, because emotions play a part in all of our decisions. It's a part of who we are to some extent or another. So lots of other professionals believe that this is the case, that we should think about emotions. Okay, so let's do this activity now, and let's see if you're able to take part, then wonderful. And if you're not, then if you're not able to submit your answers, that's fine, but just take part wherever you are. So this exercise is a favorite of mine, and it usually pulls up some really good discussions. You might have come across it before, actually. Do type in the box if you've come across it before, because that will influence your answer. So there's a runaway trolley barreling down a railway track. Ahead on the tracks, there are 5 people tied up and unable to move. And you're standing some distance away, but you have access to a lever. So if you pull the lever, the trolley will switch to a different set of tracks, but there is one person on that side track. So there you have 2 options with what you can do. You're just standing there, so you can either let the trolley or the train continue on its way and it will kill 5 people. Or you can go with number 2, where you can pull the lever and it will divert the train onto the other side and different track, but it will kill one person. So have a talk about, well, actually don't have a talk about this because that might influence your answer. So don't talk about this. Just come up with your answer. And if you are able to, either by unmuting your microphone or typing in the chat box, please submit your answer. I'll give you a minute to think about your answer, but don't overthink it too much. Okay, look forward to hearing what you think about this. Okay, I'm still going to give you another 30 seconds just in case anyone wants to submit their answers. If you wouldn't mind answering with why your immediate thought was number 2, that would be really, really useful for our kind of debrief in a moment. Okay, so this is always a favorite of mine. So it's really interesting to hear you say your immediate thought was number 2, but then you started questioning it, then you weren't sure. So the impact would be less if it was one person. However, I don't think either are right. And that happens in real life too, doesn't it? Sometimes you're faced with limited number of options and you don't really like either of them. You, excuse my cough, you have another option in mind that you would rather choose, but that option isn't available to you. And that happens quite a lot in daily life. And that's why I think this is such a clever little exercise to get us thinking about morality. And then the other comment there is quite a hard question, as I'm sure factors in the moment would make a big difference. And you've really hit the nail on the head there. There are so many but what ifs here. And I'm going to think about some of them. So over the years, I've really enjoyed hearing what students say about this. So, okay, so there are a couple of things. So it might kill 5 people or it might kill 1 person. Now, the first thing is, if you don't do anything and you let it continue and kill 5 people, it wasn't your fault. It was nothing to do with you. And you can be, you can shirk the responsibility, if that's a fair way of putting it, because you didn't do anything. It was going to kill the 5 people anyway. You didn't set it on the track to kill the 5 people. So some people prefer to take that option because it's nothing to do with them. And I can see the thought process there. That's a really interesting way of looking at it. And then the other thing is, who are the people? So we always, without fail, end up getting into a detailed discussion about, well, what if the 5 people have committed really serious, horrific crimes and have left behind, you know, huge negative consequences, either to their victims or to victims' families or something. And so then is there an argument that they're not worthy to continue their life for some reason? Now, these are all what ifs, by the way. These aren't my personal opinions on this. These are really interesting ideas to think about. And then there's the other idea where what if the one person on the other side, so all of you right now think about the one person in your life that you love the most and that you are the closest to. And sometimes people say, you know, my mother, my father, my caregiver, my dog, things like that in the past. So think of that one person. Now would your decision change? If you had at first decided, actually, the utilitarian principle is the greatest good for the greatest number of people, so I will just kill one person because it's a numbers game, and then there are 4, once you take away the one person, there are 4 people, that extra people that would have lost their lives. But now imagine that one person is your loved one, and would that change your decision? So there are so many different factors to think about here. Also, people, if you really, really want to go in depth, people say, well, what if there's somebody else standing next to me? I don't know that, so I could pretend I haven't seen it, and the person next to me, it's their decision really, or, you know, all sorts of other situations. So yeah, and think about, if you can, write yourself a little note to carry out this exercise again next week or in a few weeks, because you might find that your decision changes as time goes on. Now, this basically represents morality. We can't always decide whether we think something is right or wrong and how we feel about that. And it's often muddied by what else is going on in the situation. But the main point here, I forgot to show you the illustration of how that works in real life. So the academic studies that have explored this come out with some really interesting findings. And so we've already talked about this a little bit. So the deontological approach would be that the outcome is a person level response. So we don't want to, we want to have the least personal involvement or personal wrongdoing. And then in contrast, the consequentialist approach, which is the greatest good for the greatest number of people, so kill the one and save the five, is more logical, rational, with reason. So can you see how I'm pulling us back into what we were talking about throughout the rest of this talk about emotion versus rationality and how they play in terms of morality? And what we find, and what these studies find, is that some people with a lack of function or a low function or a lesion or an injury in the areas of the brain that are responsible for morality, of which there are many, it's quite a complicated picture. There's one area in the prefrontal cortex, which is the region above the forehead or behind the forehead, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is involved in morality, reasoning and functioning. And for these patients that have injuries in those areas, they often go with the consequentialist approach, the greatest good for the greatest number of people, because aren't necessarily, or the belief is that then they don't have the ability anymore because of the lack of function or the injury to engage in moral decision making in the same way with the use of emotion. And that can be an issue for, it's thought that that is kind of the same process that takes place when young people or people find themselves in these situations where they don't express the emotions that are needed in order to stop them from committing certain acts. Like, it's good for there to be an element of shame. Most of us in the population generally feel an element of shame, guilt, and empathy when we think about negative interactions with others. And what we find in this research and lots of other research is that offenders often don't feel those things. And maybe that's another area we can target. Okay, so I'm just looking at the time now. We're really skipping. We're really coming around quickly to the 3 o'clock. So what I'm going to do is just for a couple of minutes only talk to you about the Compass Project, the Morality Programme. I've already touched on a lot of these things throughout the talk, so I think we'll be in a good position to stop then and take any questions from you that you have. I want to make sure that we finish on time. So what's happening at the moment with my research is we have developed this new morality strengthening programme. Young people from a youth work charity called Romsey Mill in Cambridge will be coming and taking this programme, and it's a kind of a selection of activities, tasks, debates about right and wrong and about emotion and emotion recognition and empathy, all these things, to try and see whether we can strengthen those things and ultimately reduce antisocial behaviour and crime. So what we do is we have an experimental group that takes part in the programme. Then we have a control group that takes the pre and post programme scales, where we ask them about their self-reported crime, for example, their relationships with others, their attitudes to morality and moral behaviours. They take those scales before and after the programme, and then we can compare the people that did the programme and didn't do the programme to see if there was a difference. But we can also compare for the people that did the programme both before and after, whether there is a difference or an effect. We don't have time for me to talk about this in much detail, but a lot of what we've got in the slides has been covered in some way or another, you know, talking about parents and peers and family environments, talking about upbringing and so on. So there are lots of studies that kind of we used what had been used before and had worked and collated it all into this program, really. And so we're carrying out this program this year, and hopefully you will hear towards the end of the year what the findings were. So it will be really interesting to find out whether this works. It's one of the first times that this kind of a intervention program has been tested before in this way, using these different kind of subtopics. Okay, I'm not going to go into that here because I think it's a good time for us to stop the session. So thank you very much for listening. It was great to go through that with you, and thanks for taking part in some of those activities as well. And I will, I'm very happy to take questions. I'm very happy for Lauren to come back in.